What if the greatest military mind in American history never won a single battle, and almost nobody knows his name? What if I told you that the man who saved the American Revolution did it by losing, over and over again, on purpose? Welcome back. I am glad you are here, and if this is your first time on the channel, stick around, because what I am about to share with you is one of the most remarkable stories in all of American military history. Imagine you are a general. You have just been handed command of an army that suffered one of the worst defeats your nation has ever seen. Your soldiers are starving. They have no shoes. Half of them have already walked away and never looked back. The enemy controls nearly every major city and every fort across an entire region, and the government back home has almost nothing left to send you. Supplies are not coming. Money is not coming. All you have is a broken army and a war that most people back home are starting to believe cannot be won. Now imagine that over the next 2 years, you fight battle after battle, and you lose every single one of them. Not some of them, every one. And yet, when the smoke finally clears and the treaties are signed, you are the one standing on the winning side. The enemy has been driven out. The region is yours. And the war, against all odds, is over. That is not a hypothetical. That is a true story. And what this general pulled off in the American South between 1780 and 1782 is, in my view as someone who has studied military history for years, one of the most brilliant strategic campaigns ever executed on this continent. He figured out something that very few commanders in history have ever truly understood. You do not have to win battles to win a war. You just have to refuse to lose the one thing that matters most. Stay with me, because this story is going to change the way you think about what it really means to win. Before I get into the heart of this story, I want to take a quick moment to thank every single one of you who has been watching, commenting, and sharing these videos. It genuinely means the world to me. And if you have not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button right now, because we cover stories like this one every week, stories that the history books glossed over but absolutely deserve to be told. Now, let me take you back to where this all began. This general did not come from a military family. He was not trained at a royal academy. He did not grow up riding horses on a battlefield. He was born in 1742 in a small village in Rhode Island, the son of a prosperous Quaker merchant and preacher. And from the very beginning, his life was defined by contradictions that should have made a military career impossible. The Quakers were pacifists. They did not believe in war, did not believe in violence, and they absolutely did not believe in studying it. But this young man could not stop reading about it. He devoured every book on military history and strategy he could get his hands on, and in a Quaker household, that meant getting creative. He traded for books. He smuggled texts on tactics and fortification into the family home. He studied the campaigns of Julius Caesar and Frederick the Great by candlelight, while his father assumed he was reading scripture. He taught himself the works of Turenne and Saxe, the great European strategists of the previous century. He even taught himself geometry, because he understood that geometry was the language of artillery placement and fortification design. By the time the first shots of the revolution were fired, this self-taught bookworm had absorbed more military theory than most serving officers in the British Army. But here is the detail that most people do not know, and it is the one that tells you everything about his character. When he tried to join his local militia unit, they refused to give him an officer's commission. Not because of his knowledge, not because of his ability, because of his limp. He walked with a pronounced hitch that never went away, and some of the men in that unit said that even as a common soldier, his appearance would reflect poorly on the group. Think about that for a moment. A man who had spent years mastering military strategy at a level few officers in the world could match, being told he was not good enough to be a lieutenant because of the way he walked. He felt that deeply, and he stayed anyway, as a private, at the absolute bottom of the ranks. Within months, The Rhode Island General Assembly had promoted him to command an entire army. He arrived outside Boston with his troops and immediately caught the attention of George Washington himself. Washington noticed that his soldiers were among the best organized and most disciplined units in the entire Continental Army. While other commanders struggled to keep their men from deserting or fighting among themselves, this man ran a tight operation. His camps were clean. His soldiers drilled regularly. His supply lines actually functioned. Washington recognized something rare, a man who understood not just the glamorous side of war, but the full, unglamorous reality of what it takes to keep an army alive and fighting. That trust between them would become the most important military partnership of the entire Revolution. And it was tested almost immediately, through frozen rivers, bitter defeats, and ultimately, the most thankless job in the entire army. Because when the Continental Army was falling apart at Valley Forge in the winter of 1778, when soldiers were wrapping their feet in rags and leaving bloody footprints in the snow, when wagons were rotting and horses were dying and Congress was sending nothing but excuses, Washington turned to his most trusted general and asked him to take over as quartermaster general. The man responsible for feeding, clothing, equipping, and moving the entire army. No glory. No battlefield command. Just the grinding, invisible work that determined whether the army lived or died. He did not want the job. He told Washington as much. But then he accepted it because he understood something that most ambitious officers in that army did not. An army that cannot eat cannot fight. An army without shoes cannot march. And an army that cannot march has already lost. A committee of Congress had reported that soldiers were so desperate for transportation that they were, in their own words, patiently yoking themselves to little carriages of their own making or loading wood and provisions on their own backs because there were no horses, no wagons, and no functioning supply chain left. There was pork sitting in New Jersey that could not reach the men at Valley Forge simply because there was nothing to carry it. Within 1 week of taking over, supplies began arriving at camp. Within weeks, the army that had been on the verge of dissolving was fed, equipped, and preparing for the next campaign season. Years later, the great German general Erwin Rommel would write that the battle is fought and decided by the quartermasters. This man proved that truth more than a century before Rommel ever put it into words. Now, while all of this was happening in the North, the war in the South had turned into something close to a catastrophe. And I want you to understand just how bad it was, because without that context, you cannot fully appreciate what came next. The British had developed what they believed that the southern colonies were full of loyalists, people who remained loyal to the crown, and that if they could seize control of the South, they could use that base to squeeze the revolution from below. In May of 1780, they captured Charleston, South Carolina, and with it, they took an entire American army prisoner in a single stroke. It was the largest American military surrender of the entire war. Then came Camden. On the 16th of August, 1780, an American army under General Horatio Gates marched to confront the British and walked straight into disaster. Gates made a decision that military historians still shake their heads at today. He placed his most experienced Continental soldiers on the right side of his line, directly opposite the weakest part of the British force. And on his left, he placed thousands of untrained, inexperienced militia from Virginia and North Carolina, directly opposite the most battle-hardened British regulars on the field. When those British veterans advanced with bayonets leveled, the American militia did not fire a single organized volley. They dropped their weapons and ran. The British lost just over 300 men. The Americans suffered more than 2,000 casualties, including the mortal wounding of the German-born General Johann de Kalb, who fought on until he was shot 11 times and could no longer stand. Gates himself fled the battlefield on horseback and rode more than 160 miles in 3 days to escape. His military career was finished. The South was on the verge of being lost entirely. Washington did not hesitate. he sent his most trusted general south. And when that general arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina, in December of 1780, what he found would have broken most commanders. He had roughly 1,400 men fit for duty, most of them poorly armed, barely clothed, not paid in months. He wrote to a friend that the appearance of his troops was, in his own words, wretched beyond description. He was looking at an army that existed in name only. But here is what set him apart from every other commander in that situation. He did not panic. He did not rush into battle the way Gates had. Instead, he did something that violated every accepted rule of 18th century warfare. He split his already tiny army in two. Military doctrine at the time said you never divide a smaller force in the face of a larger one. It was considered suicidal. But this general understood something his critics did not. By splitting his forces, he forced the British commander, Lord Cornwallis, to split his own army as well. If Cornwallis ignored one half, that half could sweep through British outposts across the western Carolinas. If he ignored the other half, that half could cut his supply lines and threaten his communications. Cornwallis had to respond to both threats simultaneously, and that meant he could not concentrate his full strength against either one. It was not recklessness. It was calculated genius. Cornwallis sent his most feared cavalry commander, a man known for his speed and his ruthlessness, after one half of the divided American force. This British officer had built a terrifying reputation across the South. Patriot communities feared his name. And on the morning of the 17th of January, 1781, at a place called Cowpens in the upcountry of South Carolina, that reputation was about to be destroyed forever. The night before the battle, the American commander walked through his camp and spoke personally to every soldier he could reach, delivering speeches to rally his men. But in a private letter to his commanding general, he admitted he was pessimistic. He wrote that his force felt inadequate for what was coming. What happened the next morning was nothing short of a masterpiece. The Americans were arranged in 3 lines across an open field. The militia in the front line fired their shots and then retreated, exactly as planned. The British, seeing the front line break, assumed the battle was already won and surged forward in pursuit. They ran directly into the disciplined fire of the Continental regulars in the second line. And then, from behind a ridge where they had been hidden from view, American cavalry swung around and hit the British from both flanks simultaneously. The entire engagement lasted less than an hour. Nearly 80% of the British force was killed, wounded, or captured. The cavalry commander himself barely escaped with a handful of men. 9 days after the battle, the American commander wrote to a friend with obvious satisfaction, saying he had given the enemy, in his words, a devil of a whipping. The significance of that morning cannot be overstated. In a single engagement, Cornwallis had lost one of his best field commanders and a devastating portion of his fighting strength. More than that, the myth of British invincibility in the South, a myth that had been carefully cultivated to terrorize the local population into submission, had been shattered in less than 60 minutes. The psychological impact rippled across every southern state. Patriots who had been hiding their sympathies began to come forward. Loyalists who had felt untouchable began to feel very uncertain. And Cornwallis, for the first time in this campaign, was the one on the back foot. Cornwallis was furious after Cowpens. And fury, as it turns out, is one of the most dangerous states a commanding general can be in. He made a decision driven by emotion rather than calculation, and that decision would ultimately cost him everything. He ordered his own army to burn its supply wagons, destroy its extra baggage, and pour out its reserve supplies of rum. He was going light and fast, betting everything on catching the American force before it could escape across the Dan River into Virginia. What followed was one of the most extraordinary chases in the history of American warfare. But here is what Cornwallis did not know. His opponent had already anticipated this move. Scouts had been sent ahead days earlier to locate and secure every available boat along the Dan River. A rear guard was appointed to play a dangerous game of cat and mouse with the British vanguard, staying just close enough to draw the pursuit forward and just far enough ahead to avoid being overwhelmed. The American army marched north through freezing winter rain, across nearly 200 miles of North Carolina, fording swollen creeks, slogging through mud and ice, with men collapsing from exhaustion at every halt. And on the 14th of February 1781, they crossed the Dan River into Virginia. Cornwallis arrived at the empty riverbank just hours too late. He had burned his supplies, exhausted his men, marched his army across an entire state, and had absolutely nothing to show for it. Now here is where most generals would have stayed in Virginia to rest and recover. And that is exactly what Cornwallis expected. Instead, the American commander turned around and marched back into North Carolina, gathering reinforcements along the way. By mid-March, he had assembled a force of roughly 4,400 men and selected his ground carefully near a rural courthouse called Guilford Courthouse in what is today Greensboro, North Carolina. On the 15th of March, 1781, Cornwallis attacked with roughly 1,900 British regulars. The battle was savage. The Americans were arranged in 3 lines, just as they had been at Cowpens. The front line fired and fell back. The second line fought longer and harder in the woods before being pushed back. The fighting eventually reached the third line of Continental regulars and became hand-to-hand in places, bayonets and musket butts in the trees and underbrush. At the most critical moment of the battle, Cornwallis made a decision so cold it shocked even his own officers. He ordered his artillery to fire grape shot directly into the melee, knowing it would hit his own soldiers along with the Americans. It broke the assault. The American commander saw that his army was at risk of being destroyed, and he made the call to retreat. The British held the field. But look at what that victory actually cost. Cornwallis lost more than 500 men killed and wounded, more than a quarter of his entire force. These were not militia he could replace from the local population. These were trained British regulars, professional soldiers shipped across the Atlantic at enormous expense, and they were gone. A member of the British Parliament heard the news and reportedly said that another such victory would ruin the British army. He was right. Cornwallis had won the battle and effectively lost the campaign. He could not replace his losses. He could not feed his remaining army in the hostile Carolina backcountry. He could not maintain his supply lines with the American force still in the field threatening them at every turn. So he abandoned the Carolinas entirely and marched his battered army to the coast at Wilmington and then north into Virginia. That march would lead him to a small tobacco port called Yorktown, and at Yorktown, everything would end. But the American commander did not follow him to Virginia. That was not his job, and he understood that with absolute clarity. Instead, he turned south and went to work dismantling the entire network of British forts and outposts that still controlled the Carolina interior, one position at a time. He lost at Hobkirk's Hill in April. He was forced to abandon a siege at 96 in June when a British relief force arrived. At Eutaw Springs in September, his men drove the British through their own camp, through their tents and their cooking fires, only to lose cohesion when some soldiers stopped to loot the abandoned British supplies, allowing the enemy to rally behind a fortified brick house and counterattack. He withdrew again. Another tactical defeat. And yet, after every single one of these losses, he preserved the core of his army, rested his men, and came back. He once described his own philosophy in a single sentence that I think about often. He said, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." That was not just a saying. That was a strategy. Throughout all of this, he was coordinating closely with partisan leaders who had been fighting the British in the swamps and forests of South Carolina long before he arrived. One of them operated in the Low Country, ambushing British supply convoys and vanishing into the cypress swamps before the Redcoats could respond. The British sent their most feared cavalry commander after him on one occasion, chasing him for 7 hours and 26 miles through the Carolina wilderness until horses were dropping dead on the road from exhaustion. When that British officer finally gave up at the edge of an impassable swamp, he reportedly turned to his men and said, "Come on, boys, let us go back." As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him. That nickname, the Swamp Fox, spread across the South from that moment, and it had come straight from the mouth of the man trying to hunt him down. The tactics these partisan fighters developed, the hit-and-run raids, the intelligence networks, the use of terrain to neutralize a superior enemy, would later be studied and adopted as part of the doctrine of the United States Army's 75th Ranger Regiment. And here is what all of this adds up to, and I want you to really sit with this for a moment. Every time the Americans lost a battle, they retreated in good order, preserved their fighting force, and returned stronger within weeks. Every time the British won a battle, they suffered casualties they could never replace, consumed supplies they could never replenish, and found themselves holding a slightly larger patch of hostile territory with a slightly smaller army to defend it. The American commander was not trying to destroy the British Army in one glorious engagement. He was bleeding it dry, one expensive victory at a time. He was trading space for time and battles for attrition. After Eutaw Springs, the British pulled back to Charleston and never came out again. The entire interior of South Carolina and Georgia had been liberated without a single clean tactical victory to point to. And Cornwallis, marching north toward Yorktown because every door in the South had been closed behind him, walked straight into the trap that Washington and the French were waiting to spring. The surrender at Yorktown in October of 1781 ended the war. But the truth that most history books leave out is this. Cornwallis would never have been at Yorktown if the South had not been made into a death trap for his army first. Now, you might expect a man who saved the southern states, who drove the British out of an entire region and set up the final checkmate of the entire revolution, to retire into wealth, honor, and lasting fame. That is not what happened. And in many ways, this final chapter of his life is the part that moves me most deeply, because it reveals the kind of man he truly was beneath all the strategy and the battlefield decisions. During the Southern campaign, when Congress and the state governments failed to send money, he signed personal promissory notes with his own name to keep his soldiers fed and supplied. He pledged his personal credit, his personal fortune, to sustain an army fighting on behalf of an entire nation. After the war ended, the creditors came. He was forced to sell nearly all of his personal property in New England to begin retiring those debts. And at one of the lowest points of those years, creditors knocked on his door, demanding payment even as he and his wife were mourning the death of their young daughter. Think about that. A man who had given everything to build this country being handed a bill for his child's casket while he was still grieving. The state of Georgia gave him a plantation called Mulberry Grove near Savannah, and he moved his family there in 1785, hoping to rebuild. He never got the chance. On the 19th of June, 1786, he died at Mulberry Grove at the age of 43, most likely from heat stroke, possibly complicated by years of accumulated exhaustion and stress. He did not live to see the Constitution ratified. He did not live to see the country he had sacrificed everything to create take its first steps as a functioning nation. When George Washington learned of his death, he wrote that the country had lost, in his words, a great and honest man. That was the eulogy of the only general who had served beside Washington from the very beginning to the very end of the entire war. And yet, if you walk down any street in America today and ask people to name the generals of the Revolution, almost nobody says his name. His Southern campaign is studied at West Point and at military academies around the world as one of the finest examples of strategic attrition in the history of warfare. The integration of conventional and irregular forces that he pioneered has become standard practice in modern military doctrine. His understanding that wars are won as much by logistics and patience as by firepower and aggression anticipated concepts that military theorists would not formally codify for another 200 years. There is even a strange footnote to history worth mentioning. Mulberry Grove, the plantation where he died, later became the place where a young Yale graduate named Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, a machine that would reshape the entire American South. Even in death, his story kept intersecting with the forces that defined this nation. So what is the lesson here, and why does it still matter today? It is this. War is not won by the general who holds the most battlefields at the end of the day. It is won by the general who understands what the war is actually about and who refuses to lose the one thing that matters most, which is the army itself. And I would argue that principle extends far beyond warfare. In any long struggle, whether in business, in life, or in the pursuit of something worth fighting for, the person who wins is rarely the one who never loses. It is the one who refuses to be destroyed by losing. It is the one who, after every setback, finds a way to preserve what matters, adapt, and come back. He said it himself in one of the simplest and most powerful sentences I have ever come across in all my years of studying history. We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. If this story resonated with you the way it has with me, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me which forgotten figure from American history you think deserves their own video, because there are so many stories like this one still waiting to be told. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already, share this with someone who loves history, and I will see you in the next one.